Jingi walla blagami arako dukun. Jandamani nyali garama nyali nya. Nyali nya nyathan nyathan jem. Garama nyali tugun gunu. Wana jangma mala gunu. Gala tugun. Nyali nya tugun gunu. Bugube blagame.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Cath Keenan, and I am really happy to be here today with Vivian Pham. I would like to start by acknowledging that I am on Gadigal land in the Eora Nation, and Vivian, where are you today?
I think I'm on Darug Nation.
Yeah, and I would like to pay respects to all the elders past, present, and emerging on my lands, the lands where Vivian is, and all the lands where all of you are watching this today. I'm delighted to be interviewing Vivian today. Her debut novel, The Coconut Children, came out in March this year, and it has been incredibly well received by the reading public, by critics. It is a beautiful romance. The story concerns two young people, a young girl called Sunny and a young man called Vince, who has just come back from juvenile detention. He arrives back in the suburb of Cabramatta, which, if many of you know it, is sort of the home of Vietnamese Australian culture in Sydney. It's a great place to go and get pho. So he comes back to Cabramatta. It's set in the 1990s, where the suburb was a lot more dangerous than it is now. There was quite a lot of drugs, there was a bit of violence. And it is a beautiful love story about them growing up, falling in love with each other. And it is also very much a novel of family. It is about what it is like to be in a family, and particularly what it is like to be in a family where parents, possibly grandparents, also have come to Australia as refugees. Steve Eggers, who is a very well-known American writer, he said of Vivian's book that she shows a new Australia here, tied to her place and time, but touching on universal themes of longing and the alternately profound and ludicrous angst of youth. Vivian Pham is one of the indispensable voices of her generation. Can you tell everyone, Viv, where the book started for you, and how, when you were only 16, or even you might even been 15 when you started thinking about it, how did you think, I think I'm going to write a novel? Where did that start?
I think I was already getting used to writing chapters, because when I would write like fan fiction and Wattpad fiction on the internet, I was already getting used to the idea of writing in installments, and then I think that carried on with the Story Factory and with the workshops, because every week I'd hope to have a new chapter for Richard and Bilal and the rest of us to read out and workshop around. And back then, when I was like 12, 13, I would write a lot of fan fiction, and each installment, each chapter, a lot of girls from all around the world, well, not a lot, but a few of them would kind of comment and be like, where's the next chapter and where's it going to go next? So I always had that sense of wanting to write something that builded gradually, and the plot builded gradually. But I think the story itself came to me when I was wanting to write about a relative that was close to me, and a relative that had been through juvie and had kind of gone in a different path than anyone else I knew, and I found him just incredibly interesting.
So you feel that fan fiction really gave you quite a few different sort of ideas or sort of impetus to write the novel?
Yeah, it's a whole tradition. I do think it's like a whole style of writing and way of seeing other people fan fiction, because they're sort of characters that you've created on your own accord, because they're not anything like the real people. You invested so much of your imagination into them.
Once you decided that you were going to write about the family friend, about that story, tell us about how you went about that, because you did a lot of research as well, didn't you?
I did do a lot of research. I interviewed my family friend, and I would record our interviews, and I would kind of listen. I would listen to it over and over again, and just try and get a sense of his character and what kind of decisions he would make when he was young, and how he would justify his own actions to himself. That was a big part of it. Trying to get his inner voice, I guess, which is quite hard as a teenage girl, because you don't really understand teenage boys. I think they're the last people you try to empathize with, but I was trying to do that. And I think I would read a lot of um, government documents and legal. I remember in legal studies, there were a couple of cases when we were doing juvenile justice and the way that young offenders are treated. A couple of times in the cases I was reading, I would see Vietnamese names, and that kind of really struck me because in my family and that kind of stuff we never really talked about the young Vietnamese people back in the 90s and the kind of crimes that they would get charged with, or just the fact that a lot of Vietnamese kids would stray during that time because their parents weren't around, and the kind of trouble that kids would used to get caught up in. Yeah.
Which is quite different to the way that when you grew up. Yeah. So you're sort of writing about a world that your family has memories of, but you never experienced. So how did you make that come alive for you?
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's like you said, I'd go to the Cabramatta shops like every week to do my grocery shopping, and by that time there was already a lot of police intervention, and lots of things there was a lot of reform happening there already, and so it wasn't as clear the drug trade and the violence and stuff like that, but my parents had lots of memories of it, and yeah, it wasn't me and my sister and stuff. We were never allowed to go to the public toilets in Cabramatta because my parents had very vivid memories of the kind of stuff. Like they would always be like, there's needles there and everything, and they're really vigilant. But we'd never seen that side of it, and I feel like that kind of that memory that they have that we don't have, but that we grow up along with. I think I tried to use that to reflect my idea of Vietnam, because I'd go back to Vietnam to visit, but it was nothing like what my parents had remembered before the war. So I kind of tried to balance those two acts of remembering something that wasn't a part of your childhood or a part of your recollection.
Because it's interesting in the book that you're writing about this period that you didn't live through, the memories from sort of other people, but it does also very much draw on your own experience, particularly around growing up as the child of refugees. Like that's a very sort of central experience in the book. So could you tell us about how you managed to intertwine those two things and how you feel your own experience informed the book?
My sister and I felt, well, my sister is 6 years older than me, but I always felt like because we grew up spending a lot of our time not really playing outside in the neighborhood, more so watching movies together. That was our main thing, and watching music videos on YouTube when the internet was really, really new. And I feel like it was because of that, like listening to music and watching movies that were from the 90s and 80s, that it just always felt right for me to set a growing up story during that time, because I didn't grow up during that time, but I felt like I did because of those, because of the films and the music that I listened to. But I guess I was trying to make it universal in a way, and trying to put aspects of my experience, like just the difficulty of growing up and trying to find your way, but also feeling like you have a burden to, or a responsibility to kind of remember all of the things that your parents have been through in order to find out who you are. Like earlier this year, I went with my friend to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and there was an exhibition on called 20th Century Australian Art, and just a whole line of artworks following the same tradition, and each one was feeding into the other, I feel like, and they're all aware of each other. Whereas at the same time, there was another exhibition on called the Art Express exhibition, and a lot of those artworks were kids, like high school HSC students, struggling to figure out their identity and kind of reflecting on their heritage and what it means to come from these different parts of the world while still being an Australian. So I think, yeah, there's just a lot of confusion around us, and we feel like we have to kind of freeze in time an image of the country that our parents were from in order to feel like we have some sort of connection to it, whereas that country, since our parents left it, has progressed and its culture is continuously shifting, but we only have like a fossil of it. So I think that's what I was trying to do, and trying to I think that was the difficulty with Sunny and Vince, is trying to grow up and hold on to these anachronisms, you know.
Mm. And what were, like, when you were writing about the family friend, or when you were drawing on your father's experiences as coming to Australia as a refugee,
Mm-hmm.
what were the rules that you set for yourself around that? Like, how did you, because it's difficult when you're dealing with stories that belong to people that you know and people you love. Like, how did you approach that?
It is really difficult, like trying to put to paper these oral histories that have obviously been passed down to you in a really intimate family setting. And I don't think there was any expectation when I was growing up, even though I grew up with my parents telling me stories about what they'd gone through to come to Australia and what it means to be Vietnamese and what it was like for them growing up. I don't think they ever expected me to share it with anyone else. So in the first draft of The Coconut Children, I was really focused on trying to do it justice and trying to tell the story the way that they would have told it. And often I would kind of write notes down of conversations I had with my parents, and basically almost word for word write it the way that they'd said it. But as I was editing the story and as I was drafting it, I kind of felt more of a freedom to explore the different stories I was told from my own perspective and from the perspective of the child of a refugee, instead of from firsthand experience.
Did it change anything about the way that you think about your parents' stories? Like, did it change? And obviously you've grown up on these stories, you've known them your whole life, but did writing about them and thinking about them in this way change your understanding of them, do you think?
It took a huge burden off me, I think, because as I was growing up and listening to these stories, I always felt like they were disappearing. And I think that's the nature of oral histories, or maybe growing up in a written culture and reading Shakespeare in school and reading books and having all these assignments around the written word. And then when you go home, there's this kind of rich history of storytelling, but it's all passed down through the generations, and it kind of feels like it doesn't have a written body. So I think that in writing this novel, I was doing something for myself and kind of preserving at least my version of the stories that had been passed down to me, and I felt like that was really freeing. But also I was thinking a lot about the way that these stories have shaped me growing up, and the way that I think about myself in really large historical terms, and thinking about me in the eyes of my ancestors and thinking of me in the eyes of my parents and stuff like that. Kind of the way that I think of myself is so the way that I think of myself kind of takes place through the eyes of so many people, which I think a lot of children in general experience, but I think it's quite intense as the children of refugees, in feeling like your life is quite small in comparison to the huge historic journeys that your parents made in order to get you where you are and to get to the place where you grew up. Yeah.
It's quite a burden as well, isn't it, Viv? You know, like I know you've felt sort of versions of that writing the book, that you were in some sense speaking on behalf of your culture, and that's another burden as well. Like, how did that feel for you, and how did you work out how much you wanted to say on those things?
it's just strange, I guess, to write about people that you know or that you think you know really intimately, and then to write that book and have your version of them recorded, and then, yeah, to have it on a shelf and then kind of have it published and have it almost set in stone. And then you make these realizations, I think, every day that it's the way that you think about the world, the way that you think about your culture and your family, even, it changes all the time, like all the time. And I've been thinking about that a lot recently. And kind of, it makes you wonder if you have been truthful this whole time, because you write things in a certain state of mind. And um, yeah, it's just strange, I think.
How have your family reacted to seeing that sort of versions of at least parts of their story? I know it's not exactly their story, and you've fictionalized lots of it, but
Yeah.
how have they responded to that?
My dad likes reading and likes rereading the parts that are specifically about him a lot. Like he likes the parts, like the Coconut Children. The title comes from a scene that happens between Sunny and her dad. And so, and in real life too, when that happened with me and my dad, I knew as soon as he said the Coconut Children that would be a really good title for something. Um,
Can you
and so
explain what it means? Like why?
yeah.
Yeah.
It kind of means so my real dad and my fictional dad were talking about coconut trees and asking, and the dad, Sonia's dad, asks her, why do you think coconut trees lean over huge bodies of water? And she doesn't know, and he basically tells her that it's because the coconut children, like the little coconuts, need to drop into the water, and so that the water can carry them to another island where they can set root. And to me, that kind of meant, uh, I guess, I think other reviewers and critics and stuff have used it as an analogy for the refugee experience, and of going to of 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 being ripped away from your tree and your home country and having to set root somewhere else. But for me, it was, and that's a good, that was an interpretation I was balancing with. But it's also, I think, about children, and kind of, and I feel like with refugee families, it's quite, the family relationships are really complicated, and really there's a burden for the children, I think, a lot of the time, to act like the parents of, and for siblings to raise each other. And I think for that reason, it's quite hard when you come from that kind of family to think of a future where you're independent of them and you're separate from them. So I think Sunny and Vince, what they go through throughout the novel is they've always seen themselves as part of a family. And with Vince, even though he's a runaway kid, basically, he sees himself as a runaway, and that's kind of the way that he imagines himself, as being distinctly apart from his family. And it's not, and Sunny kind of just sees herself from within her family. So each way of looking at yourself is still to do with family. And I feel like what they learn to do at the end of the novel is to still have that part of themselves, but also to imagine themselves outside of their family context and who they can be, outside of how their mom sees them or how their dad sees them. Yeah.
It's interesting when we've talked about this before, but that idea of, the importance of how other people see you, or the different ways in which you negotiate the different ways in which other people might see you. How much of the impetus for you writing this book was not seeing your own experience, like these complicated experiences that you have had, that many, many people in Australia have had as the children of refugees, but not seeing those stories reflected back to you as much, not seeing them on television at night time or in that many novels? Like, how much was it you trying to write your own truth into Australian literature?
I think a lot of writers want to write something that hasn't been written before. Um, so even if as a Vietnamese kid growing up in Australia, not seeing your story reflected in wider society, not seeing faces like yours on on the screen or in novels, I think there's that resentment towards the society that you grew up in, but there's also a sense of relief, like, oh, they haven't even tried to portray me, so they wouldn't have done it wrong. So at least I can do it myself. Yeah.
What impact do you think that had on you when you were growing up, not to see yourself reflected?
Yeah, stuff that I watched growing up. I didn't see myself reflected, but my sister and I didn't just consume Western media growing up. We watched a lot of Korean dramas and Hong Kong TVB dramas, and and Stephen Chow movies. So we didn't see ourselves reflected in the society that we were a part of, but film and television from other countries, from Asia, always made us feel like there was an alternate world where we were the dominant ones. So it's just strange. Yeah.
Yeah. And because we're talking to as part of the schools program today, I just wanted to go back to you starting to write this in year 11. Like, how did you fit this in with your schoolwork? Did you tell your teachers? Like, was this a little secret that you had or not?
Well, I think like teachers would be like, do your work, because we'd have laptops by then. So they'd be like, do your work. And I'd be like, I'm writing something. And they'd kind of just leave me alone, I think, because I just, yeah. And it was just a good excuse at that time, but they didn't really read into it very much or ask me about it, I think, until the Story Factory published the manuscripts at the end of the year. And I had the book in like a physical form. And I think that's quite sad in a way, and I kind of think it points to how, as a writer, what you're working on is so real to you, and yeah, it's just really important to you and real to you, but it's not real to other people until they see it in a manuscript form, until they see it as like as a real book. But yeah, once that happened, I think teachers and stuff started not giving me more freedom, but it would enter their mind, at least, that I was working on something like a lot of other kids have things on their mind that aren't schoolwork. It was kind of more, they had to accept it more with me, that there were other things in my mind. And yeah, for year 12, I basically dropped maths because I wanted a free period to work on the book, because I wanted time to work on it, to go into the library and just to be with my story.
I'm going to brag a little bit on your behalf now, Viv.
Okay.
I know you won't say it. So the book was published by the Story Factory at the end of, I think it was 2017. I think you're right. Mm-hmm. And so then the following year, when you were just starting year 12, that was when you got an agent, and then the book was put out to publishers, and there were 4 or 5 different publishers who bid on the book before Penguin Random House said that they would publish it. And then you spent the next almost 2 years, I think, editing the book and getting it ready for the publication that's just happened.
Yeah.
So did things change for you at school when you had that behind you? Like how, or did it, I mean, now you're at university and I know you're studying creative writing, but I also think that maybe some of your creative writing tutors don't know that you've already published a book. Like, how do you manage those things?
Yeah, at school, it was just funny. It was just known. It was kind of known that I'd done that, but it was just something that I don't know, it just became like an inside joke. Like, people just see me and say the Coconut Children, and it just became like something that you tease with. Like, it's the same way that when girls would come first in the athletics carnival and go to regionals and stuff, we just make fun of them for our accomplishments. And I think that's it's very wrong, I think, to not take each other seriously and just and in uni, I'm doing philosophy and creative writing, and not a lot of my professors and stuff know, which I'm glad for. But then actually, sorry.
Why don't you want to tell them?
It's just weird, I think, and yeah, it's just weird.
And Viv, do you want to just end by telling us what you're up to now and what you think your next book might be?
Yes. Well, At the moment, I'm working on a screenplay with my sister, Kim. So she's always, yeah, she's the reason that that I think she's the reason I started writing, even because she's always loved films a lot. And the way that I wrote The Coconut Children was I always saw it in my head as a film. Yeah, so I'm working on a screenplay with my sister and my brother-in-law, Daniel Carrington. And I'm just trying to, and he's working on a novel as well. So in a lot of ways, I think I'm really focused on, I haven't written in a long time. And I think being a writer, when you haven't written in a while, you kind of stop thinking of yourself as a writer. So at the moment, I'm trying to introduce people to my sister and Daniel's work. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Viv. It's always so lovely to talk to you. It's always a pleasure to hear you talk about the book. To anybody listening, The Coconut Children is available now, and it's a wonderful, funny, interesting, and very moving novel that I recommend to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today, Viv. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.